been getting interested in the use cases of Gaussian splitting for visual effects recently, and one thing that has really piqued my interest has been combining animated Gaussian splats with live action footage. This allows for the kind of effect in the intro where inanimate objects can be brought to life in a way that would be difficult to achieve through photogrammetry or 3D modeling, where small details such as hairs are captured rather than being lost or smoothed out into the rest of the model. This was part of the reason for picking this mouse ornament for the demo. It contains a lot of straggly hairs that would be near impossible to photoscan, which additionally would help to sell the realism. The first step was obviously to scan the subject. I'd assumed I wouldn't run into too much difficulty with this, but I found that my GoPro, which I typically use for Gaussian splats due to its high frame rate and image stabilization, would not allow me to get close enough to the subject and still have it in focus. I decided at this point to switch to using my phone camera, which produced a much sharper image but had the additional problem of a lack of image stabilization, so the sheer amount of motion blur made it practically impossible for Reality Scan to align the images. Desperate times call for desperate measures, so I concocted what is officially known as a professional scanning setup, consisting of a suitcase and a swivel chair. Basically, I rotated the subject by slowly spinning the chair and used my phone to capture up and down motion. And this finally worked. Because the background wasn't moving with the subject, Lichtfeld Studio got a little confused as to what was happening, which caused quite a lot of floaters to appear. With more training, they became considerably reduced, but it did require a lot of cleanup afterwards. Before we get too far into the details, I just want to quickly go over the process of animating a Gaussian splat. In order to animate anything in 3D, you need some sort of rig where you define which parts of the model will be affected by which controls. While it is possible to animate a point cloud to some extent, which is essentially what a Gaussian splat is in its simplest form, there aren't really any tools that make it easy to do this, and I don't think it's possible with any tools to bind a joint skeleton to a point cloud. Therefore, a mesh is required where weight painting can be altered and an animator can get a more or less proper representation of what the final result will look like. To get this mesh, you can either try creating a mesh through Reality Scan, although in my instance this didn't work very well, or you can create a mesh from the Gaussian splat itself inside of Houdini. I went down the latter route using the coarse meshing tools that are available with GSOPs. I'll leave a link in the description where you can download GSOPs. This mesh can then be rigged and animated, and then it can be used as a guide to deform the Gaussian splat version of the model. I brought the Gaussian splat into Houdini using the GSOPs Gaussian splat importer, and then used the Gaussian splat's crop to remove the background. Then it was really just a matter of selecting unwanted points and deleting them. I also ran a simple VEG script in a point wrangle to cull additional points based on their alpha values, which helped to clean up a few more. You don't want to go too far with this, otherwise holes will start to emerge in your splat, but a small amount won't cause any harm. The feet were a bit annoying, as due to having them being supported by the handle of the suitcase, I wasn't able to scan the inner sides of them. I decided to just remove them for the time being and revisit them later. I then used the G-sub's Gaussian splats transform to position the subject at the origin, and a Gaussian splat sharpen to get a bit more detail out, as I often find that Gaussian splats can appear far too soft and lacking in contrast. It's important to use a Gaussian splats transform stop rather than a regular transform stop, as this will correct the scale and spherical harmonics attributes. Once the Gaussian split itself was set up, it was then time to move on to generating the coarse mesh. I firstly used I firstly used to prepare Gaussian splats for VDB SOP and then a VDB from Gaussian splats. The prepare Gaussian splats for VDB SOP isn't entirely necessary, but it can be useful for cleaning up any additional floaters or filling in any holes in the mesh. You can then convert the VDB back into a mesh. I also ran a few additional operations such as a VDB smooth, remesh, and the labs delete small parts to clean up the model a bit better. I then saved this as an OBJ file and the model was ready to be rigged. While it is possible to animate and rig inside of Houdini, this is not something that I'm familiar with, although it is something I've been interested in looking into. For now, at least, Maya is the industry standard software for rigging and animation, and is what I'm most familiar with using for creating rigs. I didn't spend much time at all working on the rig, and I didn't even bother to create a control rig, as I wasn't going to be doing much animation at all. I basically just created a joint skeleton and ran bind skin. I tried doing a little bit of weight painting, but due to the nature of the mesh, this was really difficult to get a good result, so I didn't really bother. If I were to do a lot more complex animation that would require weight painting, I'd probably run the mesh through a Z-remesh or a ZBrush, or even manually retopologize the model. Anyway, let's not talk about the animation I did make because I am obviously very incompetent at animation. Once the animation was done, I cached it out in Alembic and brought this into Houdini. I used a Gaussian Splats deform from GSOPs, linking the first input to the Gaussian Splat, the second input to the animation frozen on the first frame with a time shift node, and the last input to the animation itself. However, it seems that the mesh deformation was affecting parts of the splat that should not have been affected. A point deform node, which I think is what the Gaussian Splats deform node is loosely based on, has a slider which controls the capture radius. However, the Gaussian Splats deform node does not have a corresponding option. It would be nice to have this as a feature. I don't think it would be too difficult to implement, but I found that adding a subdivide node straight after the alembic solves this problem. Now, this mesh is made up of tries, which firstly is not ideal to be rigging or animating with, but you'll notice that when you increase subdivisions, you get these circular patterns emerging, which causes there to be more point density in some areas than others. This didn't cause any issues for me, and I would imagine that it would be highly unlikely for this to have any real impact in any use cases. But I think this is just further proof that having a proper quad-based mesh is the way to go here, which is something I would adopt in future projects. But now it's time to address the missing feet. This was just a matter of creating another splat, this time only of the feet, placing the images in an appropriately named folder of course, and lining them back up with the original splat. Because I didn't really have any animation on the feet, it was easy enough just to use the combined Gaussian splat to the input splat for the deformation. And now it was time to set up the 3D track, which I set up with Nuke, making sure to select the correct sensor size for my camera. I set up a very basic 3D scene in Nuke for this track, and then exported it back into Houdini. I used this scene as reference for lining up the Gaussian splat with the environment, and it was pretty much time to render the animation. I had initially thought to render this with Karma and Solaris, but I quickly realized there wasn't much point in this given that I would only be rendering the splat. I decided to use the real-time Gaussian Splats renderer that comes with the GSOPS tools, and I just rendered it out as a flipbook. However, shadows on the live-action footage were obviously required, so I used the mesh animation and some basic geometry for the feet to cast shadows onto the environment, and rendered this out in Solaris. Back in Nuke, I combined everything back together, and did a bit of color correction on the splat to make it fit in a little better with its surroundings. It felt to me like it was missing a subtle shadow on the screen right of the splat, so I decided to just roto and grade that part of the splat, using the camera tracking data created with Nuke originally to have the roto follow the subject. One downside of just directly rendering the splat out of stops was the fact that the motion blur doesn't get calculated. It wasn't very noticeable on this project, however one way around this could be to render the motion vectors pass on really low samples in Solaris, and combine it back with the Gaussian splat in Nuke. Either way, I think this turned out pretty well overall. It was sort of a proof of concept, so it's not overly exciting to look at, but I'm very interested in building further upon this idea in the future. Anyway, thanks very much for watching.